So with the second part of the question, we're going to amplify and drill down into this question because it is a 5-mark question. Now on the DT exam papers, we don't have a higher or foundation paper. What we do have though are questions that are written for the higher tier and some that are for the lower tier. And this is how we differentiate between the higher and the lower, just by the questions and the answers that we go through, and they're banded completely different. So we're going to look at this question because it is a 5-mark question. So technically, with what we've done so far with the other questions and these ones, these are 10 marks. So this is a 10th of your exam paper because the exam paper is of course out of 100. So we are going to spend a bit of time going through this and looking at what deforestation means, etc. Right, let's have a look at the question to start off with then. So the question we've got here is pine and oak, which is another way of saying softwoods and hardwoods, are natural timbers used to manufacture the child's toy. So we're not talking about the processes of making plywoods or MDF. This is specifically for natural timbers. It's asking us to analyse the impact deforestation and converting natural timbers has on our ecological footprint. So the key words there are to analyse, deforestation and ecological. So it's not asking about economical, about the money in the economy and why it's a good thing, why it's a bad thing, etc. Economical elements are a part of this, but most people when they answer this question will start talking a bit about the environment and then lead into that part, and you'll miss the 5 points that we need for this question. So if it's asking for 5 points or 5 marks, it needs 5 individual points, and we're going to go through a few of them and then see how we would write this question up towards the end. So at this point, let's bring in some of the resources we get as examiners. So as an examiner, what we would have is information from the exam board of what to accept and what not to accept, and this is done by a meeting that we all meet prior to well, it's just after the exam's been sat, so we can discuss what the mark scheme would be right. So even up until that point, as examiners and as teachers, we wouldn't know what the questions were on the exam paper, so this is met up with, like a meeting afterwards. These are the command words and the explanation of these words. So the key word that we've got here is to analyse, which means to, according to the exam board, this is their definition, so that's what we're going to go to. It means ensuring that the subject matter written is detailed but relates only to the issue provided by in the question. And this is where we tend to get things as examiners, where we find a lot of kids would waffle because they either don't know what they're doing or what they're on about, or they get a bit confused of what that is. So we need to keep it very specific, and we need to keep it detailed but relating to the ecological footprint that's on there. Okay, going back to the exam board then, there's other things that we need to consider. So again, as a mark scheme, this is what it'll be looking like, looking at the grid to convert your grades into the marks for this question. So the same as with marking the coursework, marking the scripts are exactly the same. So we have 3 bands, which is, you could say, is the higher band, which is band 3, the middle band, which is band 2, and the lower band, which is band 1. And of course, if you leave it blank or you completely misread the question and it's nothing to do with ecological footprints, then you'll get 0. So let's have a look what we've got to do for the basic. So for the basic is we've got to answer it with a basic knowledge and understanding. In other words, what we've got down here is somebody's explaining what deforestation is, so you give a definition of it, but you don't give any further details. So you just basically say deforestation is a removal of trees from an area of land, or trees are cut down. That would be a 1 mark answer. So the next bit we've got, which is a bit further up, is where we're looking at partial knowledge of understanding, and we're also commenting on examples of chains or reasoning. So here we could be looking at things such as deforestation in regards to the, I know, soil erosion, maybe one of them. And the next bit could be things such as biodiversity and the loss of habitats and species of plants and animals. And then finally for the band 3, we'd expect a few more things other than the ones we've just mentioned. So you could be really talking about the water cycles and how it affects the water cycles, and carbon emissions and how we use trees as carbon sinks. So that could be how you get the top end questions. Now we're going to have a look at these individually because it gives us a chance now as we're going through this to recap and maybe even revisit some of the things that you've learnt about biodiversity. So the first one is then the loss of biodiversity. Now the question does mention ecological elements, and when it talks about ecological elements, basically it's talking about ecosystems, and then it includes everything from the food chain, the food web, right the way through to the different levels. So we've got the decomposers, the producers, the first level consumers, the third level consumers. It's pretty much what you've done in science, or you should have covered in science at Key Stage 3 and certainly in Year 11. So we're just going to recap over some of the things that we could write into our question from here. So I've got the deforestation and timber conversion results in the destruction of natural habitats for plants and animal species, and that's the key thing here. It's not just animals, it's the plants that can get destroyed as well, and that could mean that there's a change in the environment and we can put certain species of plants and animals at risk. So when we talk about biodiversity, it's literally right the way across all of the sort of chains, for right the way from the lower chains right the way up to the big food webs. So where it asks for an example, we could say an example could be if we destroy some of the areas where animals would live and they've got nowhere to live, they will move from that area into an area where they can live, where they feel safe, and that only affects part of the food chain, will have a knock-on effect to another. So an example would be if we destroyed the habitats where right at the bottom, where we've got things such as the ants, the insects, the grasshoppers, then if we destroy that, all the other food sources that would use that, so for example the things that would eat them, eat the insects like the birds, etc., they won't be there because the food supply isn't there. On the other note though, if we've got an area where these insects will thrive but we destroy the elements where the birds would be that would eat the insects, then what we might find in fact is that the population of insects sort of thrive and they can cause other issues. So for example, they could spread diseases, they could damage crops. So it literally is looking at how just taking one element of that food web away will impact on the others. As regards to plants going, obviously trees provide shade, so that will also mean that some plants or some fungus that we use to decompose mass and various other things, they won't survive either because they need moist, shaded areas to grow in. But without the trees and the canopy of the trees and the leaves protecting the ground from the sunlight, then the mosses and the fungi won't grow, and so we won't have the things to decompose. And where the mosses are, they provide a massive habitat for small insects. So that's how we can write biodiversity into that question, that it's just a destruction of it or cutting down natural habitats basically will affect the biodiversity of plants and animals in that system. Now if you do need to know a bit more about this, you can always go back to your science books and look through what you've done in the science. So you would have come across, I would have thought, things like GCSE Bite Size that would actually talk you through some of these images and maybe show you some of the images like this. So this is just a picture that explains the interdependence of the ecosystems right the way from the food chains to more complex food webs. It also looks at the things such as how the trees and biomass from plants, the leaves fall off, it then becomes organic matter which releases nutrients into the ground. All of those are things that we could have added into this answer to the question. So that could be the first one, which is the loss of biodiversity. So the next thing we can talk about is in fact the emissions, or carbon emissions. So with carbon emissions, trees act as carbon sinks. They basically absorb and store massive amounts of carbon dioxide, and that's inside the trees as well. So when they're cut down, we release some of the carbon, but also this is our natural habitat's way of absorbing the carbon from us. We breathe out carbon dioxide, the tree breathes in carbon dioxide, using that for the process of its photosynthesis, and their byproduct is it produces oxygen, which then we need to live. So trees and humans are pretty much intrinsic. We depend on each other, and by us cutting down trees, basically we're sort of suffocating ourselves really, because we're losing the ability not only to trap carbon but to produce oxygen. There is another part to this as well as deforestation with carbon emissions, is when you're transporting them, and I know we said not to talk too much about the life cycle of timber products, but if we don't replenish or we don't reforestation or replant new trees when we cut trees down, what will happen is where the factories are, we'll have to transport the raw materials, the timber, further to the processing plants that actually cut, debark, and basically season the wood ready to go. And that will also add carbon emissions there, because obviously we're paying for transport, which would be fuel, which would be putting carbon into the atmosphere then. So we've got loads of things we can talk about there as in the carbon emissions and it being a carbon sink. And I'm sure the things and examples you would use here is the world's biggest carbon sink is basically the Amazon forest, and how that's being cut down and how that's affecting the sort of whole world global sort of warming really in some ways, because even though it's so far away, that carbon sink actually is something that the whole planet uses. So you could write that into your questions as well. The other part of this is what we call black carbon. And so black carbon is basically it's basically a pollutant that we find hard to deal with in the climate because it's bad for us. So if we absorb it, it gives us bad respiratory problems in our lungs, and also it gets stuck in the atmosphere, and that means that as it's got down here, the soot particles suspended in the atmosphere absorb the sunlight, adding to global warming, and then it collects on the ice and snow in the Arctic area, which helps the melting process. So in a sense, not having these sort of trees to trap the carbon with the soot and the black carbon, it increases more of an issue when we start burning woods and we start using this as a fuel source. The other thing as well with carbon emissions is obviously we need energy to process the wood, so that's also going to be taken into account. So carbon emissions is something you could write very easily into that question. Now the next one we could mention is about soil erosion and how to prevent them. So basically what we've got is, if you look at the image here where you've got soil erosion, what we can see is if we put soil on a tray and it's inclined, if we just put soil on the tray and over time we water it, eventually all the soil will just wash away off the board down to the bottom. However, if we've got plants growing there and we water it, they'll stay where they are, and the reason being is the roots absorb the water from the soil, but it also binds the soil together. It stops the soil from moving. So erosion is where we cut the trees down, and because the trees have gone and there's no roots holding the soil, that now leaves it prone for the soil to be moved. So that's whether that's from wind, whether it's from water. It just means that the soil will eventually erode away. It will move from its current place, and that has a major problem with subsidence and building. So the answer to soil erosion is removing trees from deforestation can lead to soil erosion because the tree roots help bind the soil together. And that's pretty much what we need to do. Now, there are ways around this and ways that we can prevent it. Obviously, planting more trees. So as we cut trees down, plant more trees to go back down there. And the other thing is as well, is it helps with what we call the water planes, the surface runoff. So it helps absorb some of the water and the floods. But you can also see we can actually place things into place in the ground to actually stop the ground moving. And it's surprising enough that they're plastic on here that we use from recycled goods, just to make like a mesh that we then fill in with the soil. But on the worst case scenario, you can see the land's just falling away here. As the wind or water would hit it, it'll just get washed away, and it'll just get washed away just because there's no roots there holding it together. So erosion is also another thing we could do to answer this question. The next part of deforestation is the water cycles, and obviously forests play an absolutely important role into regulating water cycles. It helps absorb rainfall, reduces the runoff, so where we've got flat land that then goes into land with vegetation on, it will help absorb the water, so it reduces the floods, and it gradually goes back into the ground, which is then released into the streams and the rivers. So it helps, like I say, that flooding from there. Deforestation also disrupts the natural water cycles, so it can lead basically to more floods as well as droughts, really, because it can act in the opposite way. So as well as we use trees to absorb water, we can also use trees to literally sustain water, to hold it in place, to hold it into the ground. And we've got a few images that we've got here as well. So we've got the high evaporation, where it's cool and wet, and you can see in this sort of image down here, this is typical of the rainforest, where it holds the water in. The sun then hits the top of the trees and the water, and that's where you get all this sort of mist that appears. And all that mist, of course, is basically steam, and that goes back up into the air and it's back into the water cycle. But if you cut the trees down, we haven't got the facility to do that, so that could lead to drier, more warm heat, because it's not reflecting the heat back up, it's not giving the shade, and it's not capturing that carbon. So the other bits of water that we've got, obviously there's different ways of us helping the water cycle. So we've got our water plants, we can build dams and reservoirs, there's various things down here, but that doesn't apply to what we're talking about at the moment, of us building things. So we can actually build things if we're cutting down trees to compensate. But the idea is, we're talking about here, that the water cycle is that the roots will absorb water and it will hold water into the ground and stop it becoming dry. And of course, as water gets dry, as soil gets dry, then it can be blown around because it's a lighter material, and that's where that also adds to erosion. So disruption of water cycles is also another question, or another answer that we could put to that question. Right, so the next one is a bit more trickier, really, because it's more to do with the social sort of elements and how it affects communities. So it's got here that obviously indigenous and local communities often rely on forests for their livelihoods and cultural practices. So we'll break that down a little bit now. So in some countries, living out the forest is something that they do. So they would kill animals that would normally live in the forest, but if there's no forest there, they can't do that. They would eat fruits and berries that would normally get from plants, but again, if the habitats change, that may not be the case, where they're no longer available or they won't grow. Again, if you get rid of the insects, there's no pollination. If you get rid of the trees, it creates a drier, more barren sort of land that's less fertile. So there's loads of things we can talk about from a community point of view, from destroying their food source. The bit about the cultural practices are things like in some of the developing countries, or maybe in the past, for example, like the North Americans, where they're linked with nature. Some of these trees are like sacred things. I suppose in some ways it's a bit like Avatar, where we sort of invade their planet, if you've seen the film, trying to get their natural resources, but to them the trees are a spiritual thing. It's something that links them together, and so obviously it's a lot of the sacred places that have lost. So how does land degradation impact indigenous people? That means people that live in the local communities. This poster pretty much sums it up, really. So we've got erosion of government and management systems. We've got the negative impacts on mental health, because obviously people seeing their environment being destroyed, or if they're being moved on so their land can be built on, that's not good for them. Loss of sense of place of spiritual connection. Again, like I say, some cultures are very linked to these environments. Erosion of cultural identity, because if we're taking their trees and their life source, a bit like other animals, they have to relocate, and so they may be moving to a more, should we say, affluent area as regards to food source as a result of us destroying the trees. So it's a case of moving them on from where they are, which isn't good. We've also got the increase in income equality. So usually the people that's indigenous, they may work on them, but it's a big companies that get the money from this. And of course, yes, people will be employed. So from an economic point of view, in the short term, that's great. You've got people working in factories, in sawing mills. But if we don't replenish or reforest the forests as we're destroying them, eventually we're going to run out of raw materials, and that company will shut down because there's no more wood for it to process. So those are all things that you can jot down as part of that question. Its impact on communities, or its social impact. The next bit then is, where we've looked at that bit, is the economic impact. Now normally we wouldn't touch on this because I don't think this question is talking about the ecological ones, but I suppose you can't really have the ecological unless you've actually got as well the economical. So we'll put the two together here. Sorry, just jumped too far ahead here. So the economic impacts, while deforestation and timber conversion can provide short-term economic gain, it often results in long-term economic losses. Degraded ecosystems are less resilient to shocks like pests and diseases, because we're sort of like taking out links or barriers that would normally prevent that from happening. And it's got down there as well, which can affect industries dependent on natural resources such as forestry and agriculture. So some of the images we've got here, you can see the pre-disturbance and all these ways of capturing carbon. So where you've got the carbon going up, the red arrows, and carbon being stuck into things, the blue arrows. You've got the evapotranspiration that's on there as well. So you can look at these and see how all the carbon is trapped in a certain way. Post-disturbance is what's left. So we're prone to various things such as the bottom, so the ground not being too fertile. We've got storms that can damage things. There's loads of disturbances from there that you can sort of draw on, and you can see some of the images on here as well. So for example, you've got all these parrots that are now clinging to the wall or to a bank or to a rock because all the trees have gone, so there's nowhere for them to live. And usually if they've gone, you would probably find that their food source has gone with it. And you can see how some of these sort of forests are left as well. So once it's been logged, it sort of looks like a war zone really. So the economic impact is quite high. So you could certainly do that as well. Right, the next one then is really for your conclusion, maybe to talk about sustainable alternatives. And the reason being is we will need wood, we'll need it more than ever, because a lot of our stuff that we're replacing plastics with are going to be wooden, or they're going to be made from a card substitute, all of which comes from trees. So paper and card also comes from trees. So how do we make sure that they are sustainable? Well, as we've got down here, we can reduce the ecological footprint. So remember, the ecological footprint is in the question, associated with deforestation, by using sustainable forestry practices such as selective logging, reforestation and afforestation. So let me just explain what two of those are, because those are the main ones we're going to use. Selective logging just means that we only choose trees that are either mature, we don't cut down young ones, we cut down trees that are mature, or the trees that are starting to age and maybe causing issues for us, as in they may becoming dangerous, those type of things. And so reforestation is, we have a policy that usually if we actually cut down a tree, then we would plant two. and we only cultivate adult trees rather than young trees. So you will usually find something that's got the FSC badge or logo on it, and that's the Forest Stewardship Council. This basically promotes responsible forestry practices, and they've got a set of rules what we can do to cut down trees or felling. So we never completely decimate an area. One of the things that you've probably noticed in the news recently is the tree that's been cut down in Scotland on Hadrian's Wall, the sycamore tree. And part of the problem is, as well as it being an act of vandalism for whatever reason, that person's done it. But the problem is now, if we don't plant other trees there, for example like other sycamore trees, then the nutrients in the ground will go, because the same way as the roots will hold certain waters in, they will hold those same sort of nutrients in as well, or even more so when they lose the leaves in the winter, because it's a hardwood. All those nutrients that then decomposes back into the ground, the balance will change. So if we don't do them quickly, the chances are the ground may change to a point where you won't be able to grow that type of tree there. And so we have to look at that, and that's part of this sort of management, should we say, of forestry practices. So we are using things a lot differently than normally. So for example, we're using a lot of paper and card for cups instead of plastic polymers and plastics and elastomers like polystyrene. So you can see we've used card for here as well. We could use things such as glass jars instead of plastic containers, stainless steel bottles instead of water bottles, various different types of plastics that can come from a natural source, so we can do that sustainable. And now we've gone through all these, we need to look at how we would write this into the question. So now we've just done a quick review of deforestation. Let's see how we would answer the question. So the question would be, first of all, whether we want to be in the first, second or third band. So the first thing I would say is always try for the higher tiers. So where we've got pine and oak and natural timbers and used to manufacture the child's toy, analyse the impact of deforestation and converting natural timbers has on our ecological footprint. This is how I would answer the question to get the 5 marks. So the first thing is I would do what most people do, students do, is describe what deforestation conversion is. So I've put here, deforestation and the conversion of natural timber can have many negative impacts on our ecological footprint if they are not managed well. So I've literally reworded this question using the same words but to give it into an answer. When reforestation does not happen, the loss of trees contribute to, and this is where I'm going to list some of the things that I've gone through. So the obvious one that we went to right at the start was biodiversity. So it basically, animal habitats, we've cut down trees, we're destroying the habitat that animals live in. Not surprisingly then, we're going to lose certain animals. They may migrate, they might die off, but either way they're not going to be in their natural habitat because we've destroyed their natural habitat, and that's what the biodiversity here is referring to. Now you can see I'm actually numbering these as bullet points, which is perfectly acceptable for one of these questions. So the next one then that we had was carbon emissions. So we'd expect carbon emissions to rise because the carbon sink or the carbon trap of trees is no longer there. So because of the reduction of trees, it can absorb CO2 and produce oxygen. So I've given the reason and also named what that sort of carbon emissions is and defined it. So again, I'll get another mark for the second one. So the next one is going to be soil erosion, and the reason that will affect them is because the roots of the trees that help hold the soil in place and prevent the soil from moving isn't there either. So soil erosion's another problem that we would have through deforestation. Number 4 is the disruption of the water cycles. So obviously floods can occur if the trees are removed, because the tree roots absorb the water, which is what makes soil erosion stop as well. And like rainfall that runs off, it's gradually released underground water planes so it doesn't cause the floods. So trees can retain water and moisture because obviously it needs it to live, but they're clever things, trees. So if there's too much water, it'll get rid of it down to the bottom water planes. If it's sort of a cold weather where they think they might use it, then they can store the water near to them. And then the final thing I would say to this question is literally to do a bit of a summary really. So we needed 5 things. So I've put down here, if woodlands and forests are not repopulated, then the industry will run out of raw materials. It's pretty straightforward. The local community's livelihoods would be affected, meaning that people would have to move away from their homes to find work, and their commute could add to the pollution. So the final thing on these questions to do is to read through the question and see if we've met all the things that it's asked it to do. So we've defined what deforestation is. It's asking us to give us an analysis of the impact. So we're going to list 5 things that impact the environment through deforestation. So the first one is biodiversity. Second one is carbon emissions. Third one is soil erosion. The next one is the disruption of water and its water cycles. And then the last one is obviously if we don't repopulate the wood, then it's going to cause a lot of issues in the communities where people can't find work because there's no materials to mine or to dig up. And the other thing is as well, if we're talking about the social area, we can't avoid talking about third world countries, like I mentioned when we was talking about some of the indigenous populations. And I was having to put some of my stuff in because I wasn't quite ready for that new technology yet. So I've ticked all 5 boxes, and that should literally be the answer to write down. So when you're writing them down, just as a guide, but make sure you know this because there is always a question on deforestation. So we're going to talk about this in the lessons as well, but keep this to the forefront. So if it's asking for 5 things, make sure you've got 5 answers for deforestation.